An alliance of sex worker rights groups are calling for several sections of the criminal code to be deemed unconstitutional today in Ontario Superior Court. There's a live shot outside the court this morning. Now, these advocates say sections of the law that criminalize advertising sex services and communicating to buy or sell sex services violates the workers' charter rights. The Supreme Court of Canada struck down the prohibition on prostitution in 2013. Advocacy groups say the laws that were put in place later by the Harper government failed to make things any better for sex workers. And for more on today's hearing, I'm joined live by criminal defense attorney Joseph Newberger. Joseph, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
So let's reverse engineer a bit and go to the backstory. In 2013, what the Supreme Court decided and how the Harper government changed things after that.
Yeah, so there is history. So there was a project started called Project Safe Haven. And the idea was it was an alliance of sex workers led by somebody named Bedford, and their security rights to be able to pull together and be able to practice their trade in a safe way was what they thought under challenge. And so eventually, up to the Supreme Court of Canada, the Bedford decision struck down a number of the prostitution laws. But what they did was, it was what's called a suspended declaration. So it was suspended for 1 year. And then the Harper government came in with a new regime of prostitution laws that, in fact, were actually more severe in many respects and highly restrictive of their ability to work as sex workers if they want. The only thing that happened, which was good for them, was they were exempt under the legislation from personal prosecution. Okay. But the rest of the legislation made it impossible for them to do their work.
So, Joseph, what's being tested and challenged specifically in Superior Court today?
So it's a repeat, frankly. So they're taking a look. This is a civil action. So this is not arising out of any type of criminal case. So it's a civil action brought by this very broad alliance, and they want to challenge the legislation, in particular the paragraphs that you've mentioned from the criminal code, these provisions that restrict advertising and communication. And they want a declaration that it is infringing their charter rights, infringing their security of the person, because it harms them in a way that they can't bind together to practice their trade in a safe way. You know, they want to run it more like a business where people would have a corporation and they could have benefits and all other things. And they're saying that the legislation really impinges not only their security rights, but their right to choose a role of occupation which they want to perform.
Is this more about legalizing or decriminalizing the advertising of these sexual services?
So that's a very good question. It's a good way to put it. So first of all, it would be decriminalizing. So if they were to be successful and have an actual declaration striking down these provisions, then it would no longer be illegal. Then the next step would be, does the government want to put in new legislation again, or do we want to look at legalization? The problem I see for them is there's a recent case from 2021 from the Ontario Court of Appeal that said the new legislation made it very clear that Parliament wanted to eradicate sex work. And so that's something that this application will have to deal with, because the intent of Parliament is what, you know, the voters and our society says. So there's going to be this clashing of interests here that the court will have to deal with, and no doubt this will go up. So right now, this is just to decriminalize, and then we'll see how successful they are in the Superior Court.
And let's end by talking about overreach and oversight. You know, this industry operates on the margins. It's hard to enforce, tough to regulate. Notwithstanding the court decision, a lot will fall through the cracks here, right?
Yeah. So again, that's another good point. So the ability for police to monitor and enforce laws with many of these sex work, whether it's a common body house or others, is very, very challenging. The focus has been, and correctly so, for police to investigate human trafficking cases where there are clear abuses of people who are vulnerable and are in very difficult circumstances, basically being trafficked. So that can continue, but there needs to be a comprehensive approach. If this were to be successful, and we would decriminalize then a number of very important sections of the criminal code about prostitution, there would need to be a much more comprehensive regime put into place to deal with legalizing prostitution, yet still dealing with illegal trafficking.
Joseph Newberger, a criminal defense attorney, thanks for your insight. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thank you, George.